The unit of work pattern. So to answer what is the unit of work, let's take a look at an example. So over here we have the create gym command handler, and this should already look somewhat familiar because we have something very similar for the create subscription. So over here we have the handle method, and we can see that for creating the gym, what we're doing is we're first fetching the subscription, then we're creating a gym, then we're adding the gym to the subscription, and finally we're storing the updated subscription and the updated gym to the database. So overall, we're manipulating two database objects. The first one is over here and the second one is over here. Now in this block over here, even though it's inside one rectangle, this doesn't happen atomically, meaning that this line is executed and only then this line is executed. If for some reason this succeeds and this fails, then we have an updated subscription, but we haven't actually added the gym to the database. That of course is problematic, and we want to protect ourselves against such errors. To solve that, we can use the unit of work pattern. The unit of work pattern, as you can see, isn't changing a lot of code over here. We're adding the I unit of work over here, which is injected to the constructor that isn't in this code snippet. And over here in the end, we're calling commit changes async. What this does behind the scenes is it starts a transaction over here, and over here it commits this transaction. If there's some failure, then none of the changes are applied and everything is rolled back. This gives us the confidence that all the changes that should happen in a command handler, either all of them are applied or none of them are applied. So again, the unit of work pattern allows us to define a unit of work, which are all the changes that we want to apply, and then we apply these changes in an atomic fashion within a single transaction. That way, either everything is applied or nothing is applied. So let's go ahead and implement the unit of work pattern. So what we're going to do now is pretty simple. All we're going to do is create this I unit of work interface and use it over here in the create subscription command handler. Now we don't really need to use it in this command handler because we only have one action of adding the subscription to the database. But in the future, we're going to create the admin domain model, and we're going to want to add or to set that as the active subscription of that admin. For that reason, we're going to add it over here, and then later we'll see how we're going to implement the unit of work pattern in the infrastructure layer. So as we said, under application, under common, let's go ahead and create inside the interfaces folder, the interface I unit of work. And what we'll have over here is a simple method that's called commit changes async. Once we have that, then we can go to our command handler, inject it via the constructor over here. So let's say I unit of work. Let's inject it into the constructor. And over here in the end, let's say unit of work, commit changes async. And of course, let's await this entire thing. Now, of course, we haven't implemented it yet, so nothing will work. Also, let's take this opportunity to change the subscriptions repository from being synchronous to being asynchronous. So let's go over here, task. Let's say add subscription async, and let's update this to be asynchronous as well. Great, so as you can see, we're still not touching the infrastructure layer, but we're filling the application layer with more and more logic that has to do with just the business needs and executing the use cases. And in the next section, we're going to talk about the infrastructure layer, and we'll go ahead and implement the classes that are sitting behind these interfaces. So this was a short and fun section about the repository pattern and the unit of work pattern. The repository pattern gives us some illusion as if we're simply working with the objects in an in-memory list of objects without caring about how they're persisted in an actual database. Then we talked about the unit of work pattern. The unit of work pattern allows us to take multiple changes to the database, wrap them inside a single transaction, and commit all the changes in an atomic fashion. In actuality, behind the scenes, maybe it's doing multiple calls to the database, but in the end, we have the confidence, because it's wrapped in a single transaction, that either all the changes are applied or none of the changes are applied. Now let's go ahead and introduce the infrastructure layer. Let's introduce the infrastructure layer. So we already talked about the presentation layer, which interacts with the user, and the application layer, which is responsible for taking the repositories, the domain objects, and in the end, orchestrating that entire use case. Now it's time to talk about the infrastructure layer, see what are the responsibilities of the infrastructure layer, and how we can go ahead and implement the interfaces that we defined in the application layer in the infrastructure layer. So the responsibilities of the infrastructure layer, first of all, like we said, it's interacting with the persistent solution. Next thing is interacting with other services. For example, if we have a web client or if we're publishing messages to a message broker, then the implementation of these interactions happen in the infrastructure layer. The usage will be from the application layer and the domain layer. That's where we'll go ahead and use the interfaces. And from our point of view, we're just sending a message. We don't know how it's implemented, but the infrastructure layer will have the actual implementation of how we're going to publish these messages. Then we have interaction with the underlying machine. So for example, if we need to interact with the system clock to get the current date and time of the machine, or if we need to fetch a file from the file system. Finally, identity concerns are also the responsibility of the infrastructure layer. So now let's go ahead and implement the repository pattern that we defined the interface for in the application layer in the infrastructure layer. So the implementation of the interface, like we said, sits in the infrastructure layer. So let's go ahead and create here a folder called subscriptions. And inside here, let's create another folder called persistence, and all the persistence concerns that have to do with the subscriptions feature slice will sit over here. Now let's go ahead and create here the subscriptions repository, which will implement the iSubscriptions repository from the application layer. So let's go ahead and implement this interface. In this subsection, we'll use an in-memory database to just store it and see everything working end-to-end. And in the next subsection, we'll replace this with Anti-Framework Core. So for now, let's say private read-only a list of subscriptions, and this will be the list of subscriptions. Let's say that this is also static, and let's initialize it with an empty list. Now let's go ahead, and when we want to add a new subscription, simply call add to this list and add the subscription to the list. And finally, let's return a task.completed task. Okay, so currently we have a very naive implementation where we're simply storing the subscription in the in-memory list of subscriptions. Now to wire everything together in the dependency injection of the infrastructure layer, let's go ahead and say services add scoped, and let's say that for the iSubscriptions repository interface, we want to use the concrete implementation that we just defined. Now you can notice that the interface is coming from the application layer and the implementation is coming from the infrastructure layer. Now that we have that, for us to be able to run it end-to-end, let's go to the command handler. And for now, let's simply comment out the usage of the unit of work because we'll implement it later in this subsection. And now we can go ahead and run the project and make sure that this still works like we expect. So we're going ahead and creating a subscription. And over here, we get the response, meaning that it worked as we expect. Just for us to have some closure, off camera, I'll add now the use case of retrieving a subscription by an ID for us to be able to create a subscription and add it. Off camera, I added the get subscription endpoint, which simply sends a request to the mediator, and it is invoked over here under queries and get subscription. This uses the iSubscription repository to fetch the subscription that we stored in the in-memory list of subscriptions and is implemented up here in the infrastructure layer. So real quick, what we have is the following. We have the get subscription endpoint that simply receives an ID, creates the get subscription query, mediate our request, sends it to the mediator, and this is handled in the application layer under subscriptions, under queries, and over here we have the get subscription query, which returns error or the subscription, and the implementation is pretty straightforward. What we have is we're fetching the subscription from the repository. If it exists, then we return it, but if it doesn't exist, then we return not found. The implementation of this, like we said, sits in the infrastructure layer. The implementation of the method sits over here in the repository, And also here, no surprises. All we do is we fetch the subscription by ID from the in-memory list of subscriptions, and we return it over here. This means that now finally we can run the project and we can send a request, create a subscription, and then we can copy the subscription ID, go to get subscription, which is the definition of the endpoint that we just created, very similar to the create subscription, sending the request, and we can see that we fetched the subscription back from the database. One last thing that I did is that in the subscription, alongside the ID, I also added here a public property called subscription type that anyone can just get and set. This is just an intermediate solution again until we cover some domain-driven design principles. This means that in the create subscription command handler, instead of creating the subscription only with the ID, now we're also passing the subscription type, so it's persisted in memory, and then we can return it when we're fetching the subscription. Now let's introduce Entity Framework Core to our project and replace the in-memory list of subscriptions with using a SQLite server.